Woburn has a rich and patriotic history, going back to our founding in 1642. Well before the Revolutionary War, Woburn militiamen fought gallantly against the French and Native Americans, interestingly enough, for the British. At that time, we were proud and loyal British subjects, but that would change. The British government started to take advantage of all citizens in the colonies. When the time came to revolt, Woburn was ready. But before we discuss Woburn's heroes in the American Revolution, it is essential that we recognize those who came before them and establish the traditions for which they fought and died. We begin here at the first burial ground on Park Street, where Woburn's founding fathers and mothers are buried, including 45 veterans of the King Philip War, whose company was commanded by Captain John Carter, veterans of the French and Indian War, and 15 veterans of the Revolutionary War. It is Woburn's oldest surviving cultural resource, and therefore our most sacred and important outdoor museum. In 1640, 7 men, led by Captain Edward Johnson, including Edward Converse, John Musil, Samuel Richardson, Thomas Richardson, Ezekiel Richardson, and Thomas Graves, came to this area and settled on land granted to them by the General Court of Massachusetts. They called it Charlestown Village, acknowledging the town and church that sent these explorers. When they came to this area, it was the home of the Abenaki tribe, a branch of the Algonquin Nation. They had a village in the Rag Rock area. In 1642, Woburn was incorporated as the 20th town in Massachusetts. The name was changed to Woburn, taken from Woburn, Bedfordshire, England. The founders also had the responsibility of establishing a meeting house, what we now know as a church. The first parish was on Woburn Common, with Reverend Thomas Carter being the first minister in Woburn, being ordained November 22nd, 1642. The church became the 23rd established in the Commonwealth. There were 30 families that followed to Woburn, whose names were Carter, Flagg, Converse, and Fowle, to name but a few. They would serve the town for generations. Sadly, it became time to create a burial ground, and in 1642, this plot was dedicated by the first parish and called Burial Ground Lane. The first burial occurred that year following the death of a child, Hannah Richardson. It is appropriate that we begin the telling of our courageous and patriotic history with Woburn's founding father, Captain Edward Johnson, who was the first commander of the Woburn Company of Foot, the militia as it was designated during this time, and where every male between 16 to 60 was required to enroll in the company. He will share the story of his life and the establishment of Woburn in 1640.
Welcome. I'm Captain Edward Johnson, considered the father of Woburn. I was born in Kent, England in 1599, where I was a shipbuilder by trade and a ne'er-do-well landowner. I was married to Susanna and had 7 children. I first came to this new world in 1630 as part of Winthrop's fleet aboard the Arbella, without my family, but with a spirit of adventure and with a hope of setting up a fur trade with the natives. I returned to England a few years later and soon returned with my family and 3 servants. We settled in Charlestown, and I was very active in the Bay Colony affairs of the day. I'm a founder of the Ancient and Honorable Order of Artillery, as the 24th signer in 1637. In 1638, the colony was looking to expand its territory and its Puritan beliefs by establishing new churches, and I was chosen as one of 7 commissioners to go into the wilderness and set up a town that would be called Charlestown Village, but later would change to Woburn. So along with John Musil, Thomas Graves, Edward Converse, and the 3 Richardson brothers, Ezekiel, Thomas, and Samuel, we mapped out and surveyed the rough wilderness where there was no shelter, no roads, very unfriendly natives, and an overrun of wolves. The area encompassed current areas of Woburn, Winchester, and Burlington, and it became the town of Woburn, incorporated in 1642. We also established the first parish. The church and the town were one and the same to us in our beliefs. Our first parish was the 23rd Church of Christ, founded in Massachusetts. You know it today as the First Congregational Church. I participated in the ordination of our first minister, Reverend Thomas Carter. We also set up the first burial ground in 1642. The funerals were plain. Coffins were made of white pine boards. The church sexton would toll a bell when a person died, and even in the middle of the night. 3 bells were tolled for a child, 2 sets of 3 for a woman, and 3 sets of 3 for a man. I had many responsibilities in the town and colony. I was a deacon in the church, the town's first militia leader, first sheriff of the county, and the first town clerk, serving for 30 years until my death in 1672, when my son, Major Matthew Johnson, took over. I'm remembered in Massachusetts colonial history for my contributions to her growth, but none more than my book, written in 1654 and established in London, called The Wonder-Working Providence, regarded as the first great recorded history of Massachusetts Bay Colony. It is said I'm considered an equal historian to Governor Winthrop, Bradford, and John Smith. I'm buried here along with members of my family and 5 out of the 6 original founders and their families, all today without gravestones to mark our burial place. I left not only a proud legacy, but many holdings in Woburn, and my Johnson ancestors still alive are contributing to Woburn this day.
Prior to King Philip's War in 1675, Woburn remained a wilderness outpost, and with it came the perils that included wild animals, treacherous weather, and marauding Native Americans. Life was harsh and extremely dangerous. Women and children did not escape the same troubles that beset the men, and were required to assume difficult responsibilities in order to survive. One woman, known as an ancient and skillful woman, famous for her attainments in medical science from that time, shares her story. She was married to Ezekiel Richardson, one of the 3 Richardson brothers, Samuel and Thomas being the others, who founded Woburn with Captain Johnson in 1640.
Good day. I am Susanna Richardson Brooks, known to all as Goodwife Brooks. I was born in England in 1595, and together with my husband Ezekiel, our 7 children, we came over in 1630 with Winthrop to Massachusetts Bay Colony. Initially, we settled in Charlestown, but in 1640, Ezekiel, along with his 2 younger brothers, Samuel and Thomas, were given land grants in Woburn to settle the town. The area that we lived in was known as Richardson's Row. As you can see by looking around at this cemetery, there are many graves marked with the name of Richardson. It's the most prominent name here in this cemetery, and the Richardsons made many contributions to the founding and to the history of Woburn. In fact, the first person to die here was a Richardson, Hannah Richardson, only 1 month old. In my day, only the strong survived. There are 52 identified Richardson graves in this burial ground, the largest family name you'll find here. And there were over 180 Richardsons who lived and died in Woburn between 1642 and 1790, almost all buried here. My husband Ezekiel died in 1647, and because the family was the traditional structure at that time, and it was frowned upon for women of my age to not be married, in 1651, I married Henry Brooks, and we lived on his land near Horn Pond. In our day, the practice of medicine was taken up by women. There were very few trained physicians at that time. I was known for my extraordinary medical and surgical skills. I helped with everything from childbirth to distributing herbal remedies, such as these. Some of the active ingredients that I used are still used today, such as calamine, used for burns and bites. Other remedies of the day was a mineral ointment that I would make of alum, copra, skunk grease, and bayberry wax, which I would use a pestle and mortar to make a paste and used for rheumatic cures. It was believed that wolf fangs and rattles from rattlesnakes strung on a string around the neck of infants helped to make the teeth come out quickly and to stop the pain. I was called upon many times to help the sick and injured, but one instance stands out in my memory. In 1670, a horrific attack by a band of the Makwa Indians, also known as the Mohawk Indians, north of the Merrimack River, attacked friendly natives of the Wamesip tribe and left many of them dead. Lieutenant Thomas Henchman, who is connected to the Richardson family, came upon this horrific scene and found a young Indian maiden who was left for dead after the Makwa broke her skull and scalped her. Though she was barely alive and there was little hope for her, Lieutenant Henchman remembered my reputation and skill as a practitioner and brought her to me. She was missing pieces of her skull, but she stayed in my home for 2 years as I ministered her until she was healthy enough to return to her tribe. A few years after that, in 1681, I died and am buried here among the missing graves.
In colonial times, local militias were formed to protect the ever-growing population. These militiamen were often needed in the frontier to protect English settlements against Native American attacks and assist the British Army in fighting the French and Native American forces in all parts of New England and New York. In 1692, Woburn men served proudly and gallantly, defending Storer's garrison in Wells, Maine. One of the most prominent was the commander, Major James Converse of Woburn.
Good day. My name is Major James Converse, Jr. I was born in Woburn in 1645, the eldest son of James Converse, Sr. I died in 1706. My father outlived me and died in 1715 at the age of 91. He was the last survivor of the signers of the original town orders in 1640. He served in various military capacities for over 50 years. I married Hannah Carter, daughter of Captain John Carter, and we had 9 children. The Converse and Carter names are well represented in this ancient burial ground. These families have left their mark on the industrial and patriotic contributions to this town. While I distinguished myself as a member of the First Church, as a businessman, and as a town officer, my greatest reputation was made as a military officer in the service of my country. My gravestone is etched with both the titles of Esquire and Major, emblematic of my stature in the community. History journals note that my military service was greater than any other Woburn man of the period. While a captain, I was called in 1691 to defend the English garrison in Wells, Maine. Supported by the French government in Canada, several Indian leaders enthusiastically joined the effort to battle the hated English crown. At the time, we were loyal British subjects, and we were proud to defend its land and honor. Captain John Alden had agreed on a truce with 6 Indian sachems, providing that all the English captives were to be returned by May 1st of 1691. Upon their return, a peace agreement would be finalized. Although the captives were not returned by that date, the deputy governor, along with his contingent, returned to Boston. Fearing treachery, I requested reinforcements from the local militia. Scarcely a half an hour of their arrival and fortifying the garrison, Moxas, a fierce sachem, attacked with a force of 200 Indians. We repulsed the attack on the garrison, and the invaders left. But Madakawandu, the most noted sachem, vowed to return, defeat the militia, and kill their leader, Captain Converse. After being rebuffed a number of times, the enemy, now 300 to 500 in number, made a final full-force attack on the garrison, which was only manned by 15 men. The women of the town, who had fled to the garrison for protection, began handing out ammunition and firing muskets themselves. Unable to penetrate our fortress and running low on ammunition, the enemy first demanded our surrender, and then taunted us to fight in the open, and finally promising a massacre come morning. I responded to their threat by replying to "Come on, I wanted work." Finally, after 48 hours of battle, the enemy retreated and the garrison was saved. For my bravery and leadership, I was promoted to major by Governor Phipps and appointed to command the entire Massachusetts forces in Maine. When my military career ended, I returned to Woburn, served in the legislature, chosen Speaker of the House, and became a man of influence and stature in the community. Perhaps my most valuable service to Woburn was as town clerk. I transcribed all loose town records into a bound document and continued the practice, providing a permanent record for posterity. And here I lie with my family, buried here for eternity.
As the colonies entered the 1700s, the tension between the colonists and the British government grew. The British Crown needed more money to maintain their global dominance and fight their enemies, and they continually turned to the colonies for these funds through new tax after new tax. The spirit of independence was in the air. The Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act in 1765, the Declaratory Act of 1766, the Townshend Acts, and the Mutiny Act not only increased taxes, but also reduced certain freedoms of the colonists. Protests were erupting throughout the colonies. The slogan, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," grew out of this turmoil. Out of this unrest came organized resistance, especially in Boston. A convention to discuss this state of affairs and how to respond to it was opened in Boston in 1768. Woburn, for its part, sent delegates Oliver Richardson and Deacon Samuel Wyman. All of these acts, resolves, taxes, and duties created an angry populace, but it took a man of stature with writing skills and an ability to stir the boiling pot into action to raise the stakes. That man was Samuel Adams. In response to one of his inflammatory writings, a riot ensued on March 5, 1770. During this riot, 3 civilians were killed and 8 others were wounded by British troops. This was the Boston Massacre. It spawned acts of defiance throughout the colonies, and the British government was determined to quell these disturbances and would not offer any compromise. Something had to give. In response to the one remaining tax not eliminated from the repeal of the Townshend Act, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty boarded ships in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, and threw hundreds of chests of tea overboard. Included in this group was Private Samuel Howard of Woburn. The Boston Tea Party infuriated the British. Parliament was swift in its response and passed the Coercive Acts of 1774, better known as the Intolerable Acts. It was the most obtrusive action to date and pushed the two sides closer to war. Woburn leaders were preparing for the worst. In a meeting on December 23, 1773, it was voted to build a house to stock ammunition, powder, bullets, and flints for the use and benefit of the town. In October of 1774, the first provincial Congress was born. Woburn sent Deacon Samuel Wyman. After many meetings, the Congress sent the British government a list of rights and grievances. In January 1775, the Second Provincial Congress met, and Deacon Wyman again represented Woburn. Congress went home to await a response, amass arms, and reorganize all local militias. The process for forming the militias was complicated but structured. Recognizing that some forces may need to quickly respond to the call of duty, so-called Minutemen were established as a specific section of the local militia, and were usually an elite group of marksmen and soldiers. The commanders of Woburn's militia companies were Captain Samuel Belknap, Jonathan Fox, and Joshua Walker, all from Woburn. It was during this period that a town meeting voted to erect a liberty pole on Meeting House Hill, better known to us as Nanny Goat Hill. This had been the site of the second meeting house. The liberty pole was an overt expression of dissent against British rule. It flew a banner containing a motto and was used by Woburn's Sons of Liberty as a symbol. Meanwhile in Boston, General Gage was being pressured to correct the unrest, confiscate all caches of weapons, and arrest the leaders of the Provincial Congress. On February 26, 1775, 300 British troops were unsuccessful in locating some of these weapons stored in Salem. The British accomplished nothing except to strengthen the resolve of the Patriots. On April 17, 1775, Woburn voted to raise a number of Minutemen. Woburn and her neighboring towns were ready and willing to accept their responsibilities. Less than 2 days later, the flashpoint of the battles to come occurred on April 19, 1775. The Revolutionary War would begin in earnest. Woburn's greatest military leader and one of the most accomplished citizens of the day was Colonel Loammi Baldwin. When the alarms sounded, Baldwin and 180 of his militia gathered at the Fowl Tavern on the Common and began the trek to Lexington via Battle Road. The current site begins opposite St. Barbara's Church and runs along Russell Street. It was the main road to Lexington until replaced in the mid-1800s.
Greetings, dear friends, and welcome to my family tomb, where over 18 Baldwins are buried. I am Colonel Loammi Baldwin, and this obelisk was erected in my honor by my family and approved by the town in recognition of the accomplishments that I have done and the services I have made to this community. My great-grandfather, Deacon Henry Baldwin, was one of the original signers of the town orders in 1640. He was a carpenter by trade, and he built our home in North Woburn in 1660, and it still stands today. It's called the Baldwin Mansion. I was fortunate enough to be married twice. First to Mary Fowle. Together we had 5 children. Sadly, she died in 1786. My second wife, Margaret Fowle, ironically a cousin to my first wife, together we had 2 additional children. But as Major of the Regiment of Militia from Woburn, I received a call on that morning of April 19, 1775. It was around 3 a.m. in the morning. I remember that it was dark and cold, and we received news that the British troops were marching to Concord. The town turned out extraordinary, and we immediately proceeded off to Lexington. We could hear that there was a great firing in the distance. We arrived a little late that day. 180 men traveled that road. That road can still be seen today over off of Russell Street. It's called the Great Battle Road. Well, after we arrived in Lexington, seeing that a battle had already taken place, we continued on to Concord, where we knew the British were going. And at a place that is now known as the Bloody Angle, we, the men from Woburn, we staged the very first successful ambush of the American Revolution. Our men fired so well that day, their muskets so accurate, that in the British columns, we killed or wounded 9 of 10 of the commanding officers that were there that day. That same day in Lexington were Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They had just come from the Provincial Congress, and when they heard word of what was taking place in Lexington, they immediately got in a coach and traveled to the safety of Woburn. They stayed at the home of Madam Jones, the widow of Reverend Jones. While they were there, they feasted on a wonderful salmon that Hancock had brought with him. All day long, they received news of the battle and what was taking place, and eventually had to leave from there to Billerica because they knew that the British troops were on their way back to Boston.
Colonel Baldwin and the Woburn militia were the first to arrive at the Lexington Green following the skirmish with the British. After assisting with the wounded, they headed toward Concord and Lincoln in search of the Redcoats. In a wooded area with a bend in the road, they engaged in battle at what is now known as the Bloody Angle. Employing ambush techniques, the militia caught the British in a crossfire. In some of the most intense fighting of that day, the British would lose 8 men on that spot. Much to the chagrin of the British troops, this guerrilla style of fighting was a perfect counter to their shoot-in-formation method of firing. The Woburn militia utilized a skillful fire and retreat plan as they continued to harass the British troops on their return to Boston. Try as they may to engage the militiamen with their own tactics, this unfamiliar style only played into the Patriots' hands. While some Patriots were shot, the fighting of the day took a larger toll on the British. Woburn's first casualty, however, occurred much earlier on that fateful day. As British troops were making their way to Lexington, they came upon Josiah Richardson and Ashel Porter of Woburn, who were bringing their goods to the Boston market by way of Menotomy, now Arlington. Uncertain of their intentions, the British took them prisoner and forced them to accompany the troops to Lexington. Before they got to Lexington Green, the British released them on condition that they peaceably go about their business. Josiah walked away slowly, but Ashel soon ran and was shot dead by the soldiers. While a non-combatant, Porter may have been the first fatality of the war. Ashel Porter and Daniel Thompson were interred in the first burial ground on the same day, April 21st, 1775. Josiah Richardson would go on and serve in the Continental Army at Ticonderoga. Sylvanus Wood of Woburn must also be remembered. He was at Lexington Green when the attack occurred under Captain Parker's command. Following the skirmish, he assisted the wounded and then left for Concord. Along the way, he saw a British soldier resting on the bank at the edge of the road. Wood captured the soldier and marched him back to Lexington. It is believed that Wood captured the first British prisoner of war. Several years later, he was given a pension by the United States government in recognition of his action. Not all stories of the war are laced with grandeur. Some are sad, but no less heroic. It was on this same day that Daniel Thompson became Woburn's first soldier killed in the Revolutionary War. His brother Samuel was there and witnessed Daniel's bravery.
Good day. I am Samuel Thompson. I was born in North Woburn in 1731 and died in 1820. My burial place is at the second burial ground on Montvale Avenue. At the time of my death, this sacred ground was full, but I'm proud to return here today to visit my father, Samuel, and my 3 wives who preceded me in death, and to speak about my family's contributions to this fine town, and to speak about my brother, Daniel, who lies here with us. I am the 5th generation of Thompsons who've called Woburn their home since James Thompson came in 1640 and was one of the 32 men who signed the original town orders. My father Samuel, who's buried here, built our home on Elm Street in 1730, where the home still stands next to the Thompson Library. I am one of 3 brothers, Daniel and Abijah being the other 2, who left their homestead when word spread the British were on their way. We were all married with young families. Daniel at the time was one of the guards to the royal governors, but quickly left and became a true patriot. I'd like to tell you about that fateful morning of April 19, 1775. When Daniel got word the British were marching to Concord, in our true family tradition, he instantly sprang to the bare back of his horse and ran with great speed to rouse the people of North Village, now known as North Woburn. Only one man he met questioned Daniel that he was being maybe too hasty and exposing himself to danger. Daniel replied, "I tell you that our tyrants are on their march to destroy our stores. And if no one else opposes them, I will. He hurried to the scene of action in Concord, where he took his position, firing into the British ranks. On the British retreat, he took up a station near the road, stepping behind a barn to reload his musket, when he ran around the corner of the building and fired at the enemy. A grenadier who watched his movements was so enraged he ran around the corner of the barn and shot him dead while Daniel was reloading. Tradition says that a well-directed ball from another Woburn man prevented the grenadier from ever rejoining his comrades. Here lies buried the body of Mr. Daniel Thompson, who was slain in Concord battle on the 19th of April, 1775, aged 40 years. May we always remember the sacrifice of the men who fought for our liberty and freedom.
While it is proper to glorify and honor our Revolutionary War heroes, we must be reminded that not every colonist approved of revolt. These loyalists were proud British citizens. Some even fought for the British crown. Benjamin Thompson, later known as Count Rumford, would become one of Woburn's most famous citizens. But in 1775, he chose to be a loyalist and served in the British Army during the fight for freedom. He would leave for Europe in 1776, where he would become a world-famous scientist and inventor. He would never return to Woburn. One man's loyalist is another man's spy. It is estimated that 15 to 20% of the colonists remained loyal to the crown. But one man who became a patriot and served heroically on April 19, 1775, was Hezekiah Wyman. Newspapers of the day chronicled his bravery on that day as the legend of the White Horseman. He represents the many Wymans of Woburn who have served our community for hundreds of years. Jesse Wyman rose from the rank of sergeant in the militia on April 19, 1775, to captain at Bunker Hill. From early settlers and tanners, brothers John and Francis Wyman, to town clerk Nathan Wyman, who had the foresight to document and preserve town records, the legacy of the Wyman family endures.
Good day. I am Hezekiah Wyman. I was born in Woburn in 1720, the fifth son of Captain Seth Wyman, the hero of Lovewell's fight, a guerrilla battle in the woods of Maine, where some credit my father with having killed Paugus, the leader of the Indian Wars. This was in the year 1725. As a reward, he received a captain's commission and a silver-hilted sword. I married twice and had 9 children and lived in South Woburn. I died in Woburn in 1779, but while I am not buried here, I represent the many Wymans who served our country and our town with great distinction and true patriotism. The Wymans are the second largest family group buried here in this cemetery. I am standing by the grave of Francis Wyman, brother of my great-grandfather John. Together they were the original Wymans of Woburn. When the Wymans came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638, they soon thereafter, with their uncles, Samuel and Thomas Richardson, came to Woburn. The Richardsons are 2 of the original 7 founders of Woburn. The Wyman brothers were tanners and learned their trade in England. When they came to Woburn, they were given 6 acres of land to start their tannery business. This was in the Wyman Green area of Central Square. As the business prospered, their lands expanded into what is now Burlington. The Wyman House, the Francis Wyman House, still stands today in Burlington. On the morning of April 19th, I was aroused by word the British were marching to Concord. I mounted my white horse and headed for Concord, catching the British on their retreat back to Monotony, now called Arlington. As a veteran of the French and Indian Wars, I knew the tactics of backwoods fighting, hiding behind trees, stone walls, and knowing the wooded area, and knowing it very well. So I tagged the British at every turn, picking them off as best I could, and pursued them to Charlestown. At this time, I was 54 years old. Years and years later, a story was written about me.
Picture a tall, gaunt man with flowing gray locks, mounted on a strong white steed, riding furiously toward the enemy, blazing away at them with his deadly firearm. He continued firing until his ammunition was gone. Since he was in close range, delivering fatal blows, he became a priority target for the British. He survived the day and returned safely to his family. Needless to say, this story went viral. News spread of his heroism, and as the story was retold, it became the legend of the White Horseman. 100 years later, newspapers continued to tell the story. When the 19th of April came to a close, some Woburn men returned home to soothe their wounds, bury their dead, and prepare for the war to come. Lieutenant William Tay and Sergeant Tim Johnson would continue following the British back to Charlestown. Colonel Baldwin and our Woburn Sons of Liberty would continue on in their fight for freedom. Of all the skirmishes around Boston, the biggest one was the Battle of Charlestown, or Bunker Hill. On June 17, 1775, Reverend John Merritt of Woburn witnessed and wrote of this engagement and the setting fire to Charlestown village, and tells how Captain Jesse Wyman and a company of Woburn men were supposed to be there, and that 5 men from Woburn died because of the battle: Samuel Russell, Jesse Wyman Jr., George Reed Jr., Daniel Evans, and Captain Isaac Baldwin.
Our men from Woburn were there at Bunker Hill. Sadly, I was only second in command. The commanding officer had conflicting reports. Some said to move forward, some said to stay back. I wanted our men to move forward and get in the action. But alas, I was a junior officer and I listened to the commands of my commanding officer. So we stood guard all around the area to make sure that no British came in from behind. Eventually, our commanding officer was relieved of his duties, and then I became colonel of the 26th Regiment. The men proudly served with me, and I with my men.
One cannot forget the ordeals suffered by the civilians during the war. Women and children struggled to maintain the homestead, while their husbands and fathers were fighting for the cause. Besides keeping their homes, farms, businesses, and family together, they needed to supply the troops with food and clothing. One of these courageous women is Mary Carter Poole.
I am Mary Carter Poole, great-great-granddaughter of Captain John Carter, a first signer of Woburn. I married my husband, Eleazar Flagg Poole, in 1756. We both were born and raised in Woburn, and we had 6 children. My husband was the grandson of Colonel Eleazar Flagg, a prominent early citizen of Woburn who died in 1726. Gershon Flagg, another relative, built one of the first tanneries in town within sight of this burial ground. It was located behind the First Baptist Church. The Carter, Flagg, and Poole families made great civic and military contributions to the town's growth and have had Woburn roads named in their honor. In 1775, at the start of the Trouble, my husband was a leader in Woburn and was offered a British command, but he declined it. He was a patriot and served in the Revolutionary War. He served with Washington and Boston. When my husband left, I assumed sole responsibility for the caring and feeding of our children. Since supplies for our soldiers were in short supply, the women of the town made them shirts and socks and blankets. During this period, the town and its citizens were heavily taxed, and the women endured great hardship with their husbands off to war. Women ran the farms, the tanneries, the shops. I ran my husband's store. The children helped a lot. They worked very hard, but they were used to working because by the time they were 3 years old, they had their own responsibilities in the house and on the farms. We educated them as best we could, the boys and the girls, making sure that they could read and write and knew their numbers. Later on, we hoped the boys would go on to higher education, perhaps Harvard University. They played mostly with wooden toys. They had their sleds for the snow in the winter time. They played with spinning wheels, board games and card games, and the girls loved to play with the tea sets. They had their own handmade dolls and the baby cradles. They knitted clothes for their dolls and blankets. In 1776, our family saw my husband return home from serving with his regiment and bringing smallpox with him. Contracted from his soldiers, smallpox spread rapidly throughout the towns as the soldiers marched from town to town. He died on March 17, and I followed him in death 7 days later, on March 24. My husband's epitaph reads, "These deaths are much to be observed. Such instances are scarce heard of. 6 weeping children in 8 days follow their father and mother to their graves. My children, dear, behold and see no age nor sex, from death is free. Soon death may come and nip your bud, and you must stand before your God." My epitaph reads, "My children, now behold and view, these bodies once took care of you, but now are levelled in the dust. In a short time you'll follow us. My loving friends that are around, our lodgings now are in the ground. Our children young we leave behind, deal with them justly and kind." Well over 150 children are buried in this small graveyard, the first burial ground. Many succumbing to smallpox, diphtheria, accidents, consumption. Fire was the #1 cause of death for children and women. It was a difficult time in our history, and often only the strong survived.
As colonel of the 26th Regiment in the Revolutionary War, I was stationed in Boston. But in 1776, I was ordered to follow General Washington to New York City. When Washington was forced to evacuate New York and retreat to Delaware, my men and I followed him. And on that memorable night of December 25th, 1776, in the face of violent weather, we crossed the Delaware River to the Jersey side and took the British and the Hessians in Trenton by surprise. Over 1,000 men were captured during that daring attack. It was a great movement for the American cause. We were with them that winter in Valley Forge during the encampment. As a matter of fact, a Continental soldier of the 26th, Thomas Larrabee Jr., was a bodyguard of General George Washington. This was an amazing honor for him, as not many ever were chosen.
These bodyguards, like Woburn's Larrabee, were the precursor to Secret Service agents of today. They were required to be men of integrity, tall, strong, and brave, and not many were chosen during the war. They were often required to maintain secret and confidential documents for General Washington. The service and bravery of our patriots of color deserve attention. During the Revolutionary War, 18 Woburn Patriots of color served in Woburn militias. Prince Sutton and Cornelius Lennox of Woburn fought at Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775. Sutton served under Colonel Loammi Baldwin. He would go on to serve at Fort Ticonderoga, Valley Forge, and at the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey. It would be the last time the military would be integrated until the Korean War. 180 brave men from Woburn left on April 19, 1775 to engage in the first battle of the Revolutionary War. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, over 750 men would serve from Woburn, and 32 would die from disease, wounds, or killed in action. As the first group of war veterans under the American flag aged, a new burial ground was needed. It was here on Montville Avenue, then Hilly Way, that the first parish, the first Congregational Church, established the second burial ground. 56 Revolutionary War veterans are buried here. As a fitting and prophetic epilogue to the actions of the day on April 19th, Lord Percy, leader of the British troops, commented about his adversaries. Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers against the Indians and Canadians, and this country being much covered with wood and hilly, is very advantageous for their method of fighting. You may depend upon it that the rebels have now had time to prepare. They are determined to go through with it, nor will the insurrection here turn out as despicable as it perhaps is imagined at home.
I died in 1807, and I joined 14 other brave heroes who are buried here on this burial ground. May you always remember their service, and may you remember the cause of liberty and freedom.